everyone, and welcome to Perfect Searches training on podcast SEO. To start, just a brief overview on what this is. More recently, Google announced that podcasts will actually begin showing up directly in the search results pages of Google. So with that being said, podcast SEO, or optimizing your podcast pages for SEO, is a great opportunity to build an audience through that search traffic. Especially recently, podcasts have turned into a very popular option for content consumption. They're definitely not a new form of content, but it is in an increasingly amount. People are rediscovering them and tuning in. And they're a very interesting medium to explore when you're trying to grow your audience and become more of an expert in the field of your industry. To talk through some best practices on how to best optimize these pages, the first area being user experience and overall page structure. So to begin, each podcast episode should have its own fully built out landing page that includes the entire recap, so a short summary of what is discussed in the podcast, as well as an entire transcript of what is said throughout the episode. There are tools available also that allow for easy transcription, but this can also be done manually if necessary. Secondly, the audio player for the playlist can live at the top of the page with the title and the description of the episode below. Below the audio player would live the recap, as we just mentioned, and a link for the full transcript, which can be on its own page, or it could be a drop-down feature. Once clicked on, it lives on that page itself. And then lastly, each podcast episode page should be linked to from the main podcast homepage to ensure that it is internally linked in an intuitive way, to ensure that it is not being orphaned or not being internally linked to make it more difficult for users to find. And on the right-hand side there, you can just see a screenshot of the Town Hall podcast page with that short description under the title, the player function, and then the beginning of the recap right under there. And then underneath that screenshot, you'll see an example of what a transcript could look like of the conversations that's happening, whether it's just one person speaking or a dialogue between multiple people. The second area of optimization is on-page optimizations. So I'm sure you have heard of metadata optimizations. So optimizing the title tag, the meta description, and the H1 tags for these pages as well. And then on top of that, the content itself. So those recaps, transcripts as well. If the conversation is keyword heavy, likely very relevant to your web page in terms of the rankings you want to rank for. Making sure for both of those areas that it's including relevant keywords that are a good mix of higher search volume and lower competition. So it's more likely that you'll be able to compete for those terms. Secondly, you'll also want to internally link elsewhere throughout your site on these pages. So similar to how you would want to link to each individual podcast episode from the podcast homepage, you would also want to leave internal links to, say you mention a blog post that you've written in the podcast, you can link to that blog post, or if you discuss one of your services that you offer, you can link to that specific service page too. And then lastly, add images to those podcast pages. It makes it more engaging for users. And each image should have an optimized alt tag, which explains the context of the image, as well as provides additional keyword opportunities. Alt tags are used for search engines to better understand what the image looks like, but it is also very helpful for the visually impaired for them to better understand what the image actually is. Next, we have RSS tags. So you should always add RSS tags to each of the podcast episodes in order to allow the podcast to actually appear in the Google search results along with, the individual episode descriptions and an embedded player for each of these episodes. So on the left-hand side there, you can see a screenshot of the Zebra podcast. They have that homepage for the podcast appearing in the Google results, but below that you can see the most recent episodes, when it was posted, how long that episode is, the title of the episode, and they have that player available for you. So the listener doesn't even have to go to your page itself. If they want to, they can listen right inside Google. So in order to index a podcast in this way, there are a few specific steps you need to take. So first, you need to expose a valid RSS feed describing the podcast that conforms to specific RSS specifications, as well as very specific feed requirements. There is also a link on this slide too if you're interested in learning a little bit more there. As we mentioned previously, which is a best practice, but just making sure you have a dedicated homepage with all of these elements. The homepage must have a link pointing to your RSS feed as well for this to function. And then finally, the homepage, the RSS feed, and any non-blocked audio files must be exposed to Googlebot. So the crawler specifically for Google, they must not require a login, so this cannot be gated to them, and it must not be protected within a robots.txt file, which would essentially block their ability from viewing this, or adding a no index tag. You don't want to do that either, because then it would not be indexed in the search results and also not being exposed to Googlebot. The final area for optimization for your podcasts is off-page. So we just discussed some on-page opportunities. Now talking about what you can do off of these individual episode pages and the homepage themselves, the largest opportunity being backlinks. So as a brief recap, backlink is any instance where a website or a blog post or an article has linked back to our podcast, whether they link back to our homepage or an individual episode, which allows users to be referred directly to our page. And it also is a great opportunity to strengthen your domain authority and page authority for specific podcast pages, to boost your authority and the trustworthiness of your site in the eyes of Google by gaining these high quality backlinks. So some strategies to increase backlinks for your podcast: have guests. If you have specific guests in the industry on your podcast, ask them to link back to their episode page. Mention that they were a guest on your podcast, on their own website. They could have a brief description on what it was, and they can ask their following to go ahead and listen to it. So that's one opportunity if you are already having guests on your podcast, or a completely new opportunity if up until this point your podcast has only been the host. Secondly is looking for any roundup articles or best of lists to be featured on. So asking online publications to include, in this instance, as we previously showed, the Town Hall podcast in their list of roundups, or the top 10 best technology podcasts you should listen to, because of course that will help search engines understand that you are more high quality, but also those roundup lists are likely receiving a pretty strong amount of traffic from humans too. So if they are interested in technology podcasts and they read this list, it's very likely that they'll click into your website, poke around, and begin listening to your own podcast. If there are other podcasts as well, so if you have a host that is very knowledgeable in the technology or software space, you can begin reaching out to see if she or he could then guest star on other podcasts and link back to our own podcast. And then finally, Wikipedia. If any of our podcast guests have their own Wikipedia pages, we could suggest edits to include the episode in the appearances section of that Wikipedia page, or a similar section as well, to begin receiving referral traffic from Wikipedia. So those are just some of the top ways to optimize for podcast SEO. Thank you again for listening.